The Strait of Hormuz is not about oil. That was the surface layer, the story we were told so we would stop asking questions. And most people did stop. But the strait has never been about oil in the way you think. It has always been about something far older, something that lives in the human psyche and has never been exorcised, something that the Bible calls the Pharaoh mind and that modern psychology calls the authoritarian shadow. And here is the part that changes everything. That mind does not just live in ancient history or in geopolitics. It lives in you, right now. In the way you control, the way you grasp, the way you refuse to let go. And until you see it, you are playing its game without knowing the rules. Let me ask you something you have probably never considered. When you hear the Strait of Hormuz, what comes to mind? Oil tankers, geopolitical tension, Iran, the United States Navy, a choke point that could shut down the global economy. That is the surface. That is what every news channel, every think tank, every policy paper tells you. And it is not wrong. But it is standing on the surface of something much deeper. The Strait of Hormuz is not a modern problem. It is not even a geopolitical problem. It is a psychological symptom, a manifestation of a pattern that has been repeating itself for at least 3,000 years. And once you see that pattern, you will never look at geopolitics the same way again. And more importantly, you will never look at yourself the same way again. Here is the question that the surface never asks. Why does the same stretch of water keep generating the same kind of conflict across millennia? The Persians taxed it. The Portuguese fortified it. The British and the Safavids partnered to control it. The Americans reflagged tankers to protect it. The Iranians seized ships to threaten it. The same pattern over and over with different flags, different technologies, different empires. And every time, the stated reason is the same: resources, security, national interest. But that is the surface. That is the layer that the institution preserves because it is safe to talk about. What was never unpacked publicly is this: the strait is not the prize, the strait is the stage. And the real drama is about something that has nothing to do with oil. This is where the depth begins. In the book of Exodus, there is a figure who has become a metaphor for the entire pattern of control and domination: Pharaoh. But if you read the text the way it was originally written, not the way it was flattened by centuries of sermons, something emerges that most people miss. The Hebrew word for Pharaoh is paro. It is not a name. It is a title. It means the great house, the palace, the institution. And the biblical authors were careful to never use it as a personal name. Because they were not writing about one man, they were writing about a system, a way of organizing power that treats human beings as assets, that sees the world as something to be controlled and extracted, that cannot tolerate any choke point being outside its grasp. That is the Pharaoh mind. And it has never gone away. Now, here is what stops most people. The Strait of Hormuz was part of this pattern before the Bible was written, and it continues to be part of it today. The same water that the Achaemenid Persians taxed in 525 BCE is the same water that Iran threatens to close in 2025. Same geography, same psychology, different empire. The Persians were Pharaoh, the Portuguese were Pharaoh, the British were Pharaoh. The Americans became Pharaoh. And every time, the pattern repeats because the pattern is not about the water. It is about the mind that cannot tolerate a choke point beyond its control. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. The same pattern does not just play out in geopolitics. It plays out in your life, in the way you hold on to relationships that are draining you because you cannot tolerate the uncertainty of letting go, in the way you micromanage your employees because you cannot trust anyone else to do it right, in the way you check your phone compulsively because you cannot stand not knowing what is happening, in the way you hold on to beliefs that no longer serve you because the alternative feels like chaos. That is the Pharaoh mind inside you right now. And it has been running your life without your permission. Let me show you the evidence. In 2003, psychologists Dasher Keltner and Deborah Gruenfeld published a study in Psychological Review that changed how we understand power. They found that when people are primed with a sense of power, they show a 0.6 gate standard deviation increase in approach-oriented behavior. That means they become more willing to take risks, to push boundaries, to reach for more. But here is the problem. They also showed a 0.42 standard deviation decrease in inhibition. That means they become less empathetic, less self-aware, less able to see the perspective of others. Power does not corrupt. Power reveals. And what it reveals is the Pharaoh mind that was already there. Another study published in 2009 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology by Van Dyke and Van Knippenberg found that high-status individuals showed a 23% higher endorsement of what they called "my rule the world" statements. That is a direct measure of the Pharaoh mindset. The belief that the world should conform to my will, that choke points should be under my control, that resources should flow according to my plan. And this is not a problem that only exists in dictators or CEOs. It exists in the way you drive, the way you argue, the way you insist on being right. Now watch what happens when we apply this to the Strait of Hormuz. The standard geopolitical narrative says the strait matters because 21% of global oil consumption passes through it. That is the surface. But the depth is this: the strait is not about oil. Oil is just the current resource. Before oil, it was spices. Before spices, it was silk. Before silk, it was pearls. Before pearls, it was the toll that Darius the Great collected in the 6th century BCE. The resource changes, the control pattern does not. And that pattern is the Pharaoh mind. For a moment, step back and look at this from a different angle. If what you are hearing right now is starting to crack something open, stay with this. This is exactly the kind of depth that the surface preserves but rarely opens. And what comes next will change how you see everything, not just the strait, not just geopolitics, but the architecture of your own mind. If something just shifted in how you read the world, if the pattern behind the strait just stopped being about oil and started being about a mind, subscribe to keep walking through these stories with us. Each one decodes a different layer of the same ancient pattern that runs through scripture, history, and your own daily decisions. And the next one always changes more than the last. If that recognition is real for you, drop a word in the comments. Tell me the first choke point you noticed in your own life after hearing this, the resource you've been trying to control. In 1950, a group of researchers led by Theodor Adorno published a landmark study called The Authoritarian Personality. They surveyed over 100 people and identified something they called the F scale, F for fascism. It measured a personality type that is characterized by deference to strong authority, aggression toward those who are weaker, and a belief in a singular, all-controlling authority that governs everything. The study found that 42% of respondents who scored in the top quartile of the F scale expressed a belief in a singular, all-controlling authority. What Adorno discovered is the Pharaoh mind mapped into the 20th century, and it has not gone away. Here is the connection that changes everything. The Strait of Hormuz is not a geopolitical problem. It is an F-scale problem. It is a problem of the authoritarian shadow projected onto geography. The nations that compete for control of the strait are not acting out of strategic necessity. They are acting out of a psychological compulsion that has been embedded in human consciousness for thousands of years. The same compulsion that made Pharaoh refuse to let the Israelites go, even after 10 plagues. The same compulsion that made the Portuguese build a fort on Hormuz Island in 1507. The same compulsion that made the United States reflag Kuwaiti tankers in 1987. The compulsion to control the choke point. Because if you control the choke point, you control the flow. And if you control the flow, you are God. Now here is the deeper layer. The Strait of Hormuz is not just any choke point. It is a symbol of the original choke point, the one that the Pharaoh mind is always trying to control. In the book of Exodus, when Pharaoh refuses to let the people go, what is he really trying to control? The flow of life, the freedom of human beings to move, to worship, to become what they are meant to become. The Pharaoh mind cannot tolerate freedom, because freedom means uncertainty. Freedom means the choke point is not under control. And that is the one thing the Pharaoh mind cannot stand. And this is where it gets dangerous for you. Because the Pharaoh mind does not just live in geopolitics. It lives in your nervous system. It lives in the way you react when someone challenges your authority. It lives in the way you cling to certainty when you feel uncertain. It lives in the way you try to control the people around you because you are afraid of what will happen if you let go. The Strait of Hormuz is not a political problem. It is a mirror. Think about that for a moment. The Strait of Hormuz has been the site of conflict for over 2,500 years. That is not a coincidence. That is a result of the same pattern repeating itself because the pattern has never been resolved. It has only been managed. And management is what the surface does. The surface keeps the system running by pretending the real problem is about oil or security or national interest. The surface tells you that if you control the strait, you control the world. But the depth knows something different. The depth knows that the strait is not the problem. The problem is the mind that needs to control the strait in the first place. Now here is the part that will make you stop completely. The same psychological study that measured the F scale in 1950 has been replicated multiple times since. In 2018, a meta-analysis of 45 studies published in the journal Political Psychology confirmed that the authoritarian personality is cross-cultural, stable across time, and measurable. It is not a Western phenomenon. It is not a modern phenomenon. It is a human phenomenon. And it expresses itself in every domain of life. In politics, in religion, in families, in corporations, and yes, in geopolitics. But here is what the meta-analysis also found. The authoritarian personality is not fixed. It can be activated by threat. When people feel threatened, their preference for strong authority increases. Their tolerance for ambiguity decreases. Their need for control intensifies. And that is exactly what the Strait of Hormuz does. It is a constant source of threat. The threat of closure, the threat of war, the threat of economic collapse. And that threat activates the Pharaoh mind in entire nations. And now you see the full picture. The Strait of Hormuz is not about oil. It never was. The strait is a trigger, a psychological trigger that activates the oldest pattern of human consciousness. The pattern of control, the pattern of domination, the pattern that the Bible calls Pharaoh, and that psychology calls the authoritarian shadow. And every time a tanker passes through that narrow stretch of water, the pattern is reinforced. The system tells you that the strait is a choke point, but the depth knows that the choke point is not in the water. The choke point is in the mind. And that is the point where the mirror turns toward you. Have you ever noticed how you react when someone disagrees with you? Have you noticed the tightening in your chest, the urge to correct, the need to be right? That is the Pharaoh mind. That is your personal Strait of Hormuz. That is the narrow passage where you feel the need to control the flow of conversation, of opinion, of relationship. And until you see it, you will keep building your own empire of control and calling it normal. In 2008, a study published in Nature Neuroscience by Zink and colleagues used fMRI to examine what happens in the brain when people experience a brief sense of power. They found that the ventral striatum, a region associated with reward, showed a 0.45% increase in bold signal. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, a region associated with strategic planning, also activated. But here is what is most disturbing. The posterior cingulate cortex, a region associated with self-reflection, showed reduced activity. What that means is that when you feel powerful, your brain rewards you for it, helps you plan how to get more, and simultaneously reduces your capacity for moral self-reflection. That is the neurobiology of the Pharaoh mind. And to really feel this, to let it land, you have to stop and consider what this means for the people who control the Strait of Hormuz. The decision-makers, the generals, the CEOs of oil companies, the politicians who order the reflagging of tankers. Their brains are wired to reward them for control and to reduce their capacity for self-reflection. They are not evil. They are trapped in the same pattern that has been running for thousands of years. And so are you. The Strait of Hormuz is not the problem. The problem is the mind that built the temples, the empires, the fortresses, the navies, the oil contracts, the sanctions, the threats, the seizures, the counter-seizures. The problem is the mind that cannot tolerate the uncertainty of a choke point it does not control. And that mind is the same mind that the book of Exodus calls Pharaoh. The institution preserved this truth on the surface. The depth reveals that the Pharaoh mind is not a historical figure. It is a psychological structure. Let me bring you back to the beginning now. Remember what I said at the start. The Strait of Hormuz is not about oil. Both layers are real. The oil is real. The geopolitics are real. The national interests are real. But they are the surface. They are what the institution preserved because it could be spoken publicly. What could not be unpacked publicly is the depth, the pattern, the Pharaoh mind that still lives in us. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Sit with that for a moment. The Strait of Hormuz has been a choke point for over 2,500 years. That is longer than the Bible has existed as a completed text, longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the English language. And in all that time, the pattern has not changed. The names have changed, the resources have changed, the technology has changed. But the pattern is the same, and the pattern is still running. If something just shifted in how you read geopolitics, if the Strait just stopped being about oil and started being about the Pharaoh mind you recognize in yourself, subscribe to keep walking through these stories with us. Each one decodes a different layer of the same ancient pattern hidden beneath the headlines. And I want to know where this recognition is landing on the planet right now in the same moment you're reading this. So drop "I'm awake" in the comments and tell me what city you are watching from. London, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Seoul, Cairo, Los Angeles, because this recognition is simultaneously arriving everywhere, and I want to see its footprint. And you have to ask yourself a question. If the pattern has been running for 2,500 years and we have never solved it, what makes you think it is going to solve itself now? What makes you think that more negotiations, more sanctions, more naval deployments, more alliances will break the pattern? They will not. They cannot. Because the pattern is not in the geopolitics. The pattern is in the mind. And until the mind changes, the Strait will keep generating the same conflict. And so will every other choke point in your life. This is the uncomfortable truth that the surface cannot admit. The surface tells you that the problem is out there. The problem is Iran. The problem is the United States. The problem is the oil dependency. The problem is the choke point. But the depth knows that the problem is in here. And that is why the pattern keeps repeating. Because it is easier to fight over the Strait than it is to fight the Pharaoh inside yourself. Let me show you exactly how this pattern shows up in your daily life. The next time you feel the urge to correct someone, pause. The next time you feel the need to control an outcome, notice. The next time you feel your chest tighten because things are not going according to your plan, observe. That is the Pharaoh mind. That is the same energy that built the fort on Hormuz Island. That is the same energy that ordered the reflagging of the tankers. That is the same energy that refused to let the people go. It is not out there. It is in you. And here is the part that makes this both terrifying and liberating. The Pharaoh mind is not you. It is not your true self. It is a pattern that has been running in human consciousness for so long that it feels like you, but it is not you. It is a program, a survival mechanism that was once useful and has now become a prison. And the Strait of Hormuz is the symbol of that prison, a narrow passage that you must control because if you do not, the flow of life will go somewhere else. And the Pharaoh mind cannot tolerate that. Now look at what happens when you apply this to the most current events. In April 2019, Iran seized the LPG tanker Khalij Fars in the Strait of Hormuz. Within 2 days, Brent crude oil prices spiked by 5%. The global economy trembled. The surface narrative was about Iranian aggression, about the breakdown of the nuclear deal, about the need for maritime security. But the depth narrative was something else entirely. The depth narrative was the same pattern that has been playing for 2,500 years. A power asserting control over the choke point, a threat that activates the authoritarian shadow in response. A cycle that never ends because it cannot end until the mind changes. And you have to ask yourself, what is the Strait of Hormuz in your life? What is the narrow passage that you feel you must control? Your relationship, your career, your reputation, your money, your health, your spiritual status, your certainty about what happens after death. Every one of those is a Strait of Hormuz. Every one of them triggers the same pattern. The grasping, the control, the refusal to let go. The belief that if you do not control this, everything will collapse. And here is what the depth reveals that the surface cannot. The Strait of Hormuz is a mirror, which means the control pattern is the problem. The control pattern is what keeps the cycle running. The fear of the choke point is what gives the choke point its power. And the only way out is not to seize control of the Strait. The only way out is to release the need to control the Strait. In geopolitics, that is almost impossible. In your own life, it is the only path to freedom. I want you to feel the weight of this. For thousands of years, human beings have been fighting over the same stretch of water. For thousands of years, we have been building empires, navies, treaties, alliances, and none of it has broken the pattern. The pattern is still running. The Strait of Hormuz is still a flashpoint. The Pharaoh mind is still in power. And the only way out is the way that Exodus describes. You have to walk through the water. You have to leave the empire behind. You have to trust that the choke point is not the end. It is the passage to something new, and that is the teaching that the institution preserved on the surface. The Exodus story is one of the most famous stories in human history, a people walking through the sea, leaving slavery, entering the wilderness. But the depth reveals that the Exodus is not a historical event. It is a psychological process. It is what happens when you decide to stop being Pharaoh and start being free. It is what happens when you stop trying to control the strait and start walking through it. Now here is the challenge. The Exodus took one night. The wilderness took 40 years. The journey from Egypt to freedom is not a single event. It is a process, and the process is long. The pattern of the Pharaoh mind is so deeply embedded in your nervous system that you cannot simply decide to be free and be free. You have to walk through the wilderness. You have to learn to trust a different way of being. And the wilderness has no choke points. The wilderness is open. And that is terrifying for the Pharaoh mind. But this is exactly why the Strait of Hormuz matters. It matters because it is a symbol of everything that keeps us trapped. The need to control, the need to secure, the need to grasp. And the deeper you go, the more you realize that the strait is not the problem. The strait is the classroom. And the lesson is this: you cannot be free until you stop needing to control the choke point. And the only way to stop needing to control the choke point is to learn that the flow of life does not depend on your control. It depends on something far older and far more trustworthy than your Pharaoh mind. Let me bring this to a close. The Strait of Hormuz is not about oil. It never was. It is about the Pharaoh mind that still lives in us. And the Pharaoh mind is not a historical figure. It is a psychological structure that has been running human civilization for thousands of years. And it is running your life right now in ways you do not even notice. But here's the good news. The same traditions that preserve the surface also preserve the depth. The depth is available to anyone who has the courage to go beyond the surface. And once you go deep enough, you find that the Strait of Hormuz is not a choke point. It is a doorway. A doorway into the vast open space that exists when you stop trying to control everything. A doorway into the wilderness where the Pharaoh mind cannot follow. And once you see it, you do not go back. You cannot go back. Because the surface no longer makes sense. The surface tells you that the strait is about oil. But you know better. You know that the strait is about the ancient, never-ending struggle between the mind that controls and the spirit that releases. And you know now which side you are on. In the next video, we will take the next step into that wilderness. We will look at what happens after you leave the strait behind. What happens when you walk through the choke point. And what freedom actually feels like when the Pharaoh mind finally releases its grip. The journey is just beginning. And once you see it, you do not go back. But here is the problem. Knowing that the Pharaoh mind is inside you does not automatically free you from it. In fact, intellectual recognition is one of the ways the Pharaoh mind protects itself. It says, I understand the pattern, therefore I am above it. That is the most dangerous trap of all. Because the Pharaoh mind is not a concept you can understand. It is a pattern you must feel. And until you feel it in your body, in your nervous system, in the way you react when your partner disagrees with you, you are still trapped. You have just learned a new vocabulary for the trap. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. In 2015, a team of neuroscientists at the University of Zurich, led by Ernst Fehr, published a study in the journal Neuron that examined what happens in the brain when people are asked to relinquish control. The participants were given a task where they could either make a decision themselves or delegate it to someone else. The brain scans showed something remarkable. When participants delegated control, the amygdala showed increased activation. The amygdala is the fear center. The simple act of giving up control triggered a measurable fear response in the brain. And that fear response was stronger in people who scored higher on measures of authoritarianism. Now watch what this means for you. Every time you let go of control, your brain treats it as a threat. It is not a matter of willpower. It is a matter of neurobiology. The Pharaoh mind is wired into your limbic system, and that is why the pattern is so hard to break. You cannot think your way out of a pattern that is older than your thinking brain. You have to feel your way out, and that requires something most people never learn how to do. Here is the part that the surface never tells you. The Pharaoh mind is not just a pattern of behavior. It is a pattern of identity. It is who you think you are. When you are in the Pharaoh mind, you believe that you are the one controlling the choke point. You are the one keeping everything together. You are the one making the decisions. And that belief feels good. It feels powerful. It feels like you matter. And letting go of that control feels like death. Because in a way, it is death. The death of the version of you that needs to be in control. And that is precisely what the biblical story of Exodus is really about. It is not a story about an ancient king who refused to free slaves. It is a story about the human psyche and the journey it must take to become free. The 10 plagues are not supernatural events. They are the 10 ways that the Pharaoh mind resists transformation. The 10 ways that your ego fights against letting go. The plagues represent the progressive breakdown of the control pattern. Water turning to blood is the loss of your resources. Frogs are the irritation that comes when your system is disrupted. Lice are the small inconveniences that become unbearable. Darkness is the loss of clarity. The death of the firstborn is the death of your most cherished identity. The part of you that you thought was essential, the part you could not imagine living without. And in the story, Pharaoh says no to every single one. Because the Pharaoh mind would rather see everything destroyed than let go. And that is the pattern you can see playing out in geopolitics right now. Nations would rather see the Strait of Hormuz closed, see the global economy collapse, see tanks roll into cities, than admit that the pattern of control is the problem. And you would rather see your relationships fail, see your health deteriorate, see your soul shrivel, than admit that your need to control is destroying you. And if you just saw yourself in Pharaoh, if you recognize that you would rather lose everything than surrender control, then you know this story is not ancient history. It is your morning. Subscribe to keep walking through these stories with us, because what you just uncovered is only the surface of the iceberg. Below it lies the full map of how the psyche escapes Egypt. Drop "I'm awake" in the comments and tell me what city you are watching from: London, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Seoul, Cairo, Los Angeles. Because this recognition is happening simultaneously across the globe right now. I'm awake to the Pharaoh inside me. What about you? Sit with that for a moment. The Strait of Hormuz is not a political problem, it is a psychological symptom, and until we treat the psychological cause, the symptom will keep returning. In different forms, with different names, in different centuries, but always the same symptom. The need to control the choke point, the need to be the one who decides who passes and who does not, the need to be God. And now the mirror turns toward you fully. Where is the Strait of Hormuz in your life? What is the narrow passage that you have been trying to control for years, maybe decades, and it never works, but you keep trying? Is it your relationship with your parents? Is it your career path? Is it your weight? Is it your addiction? Is it your need to be right in every argument? Is it your need to control what other people think of you? Pay attention to what rises in your body when you read that question. The tightening, the resistance, the urge to change the subject, that is the Pharaoh mind. That is the part of you that would rather keep fighting the same losing battle than admit that the battle is not worth fighting. That is the part of you that would rather build another empire than walk through the wilderness. And this is where the depth of the biblical tradition reveals something that the surface cannot. The wilderness is not a punishment. It is a cure. The 40 years in the desert were not God's way of being angry with the Israelites. They were God's way of healing them. You cannot get the Pharaoh mind out of your nervous system in a day. It takes time. It takes hunger. It takes thirst. It takes the complete breakdown of every control system you have built. And that is precisely what the wilderness provides. The wilderness is the place where you have no choke points to control. You have no resources to manage. You have no empire to protect. You have nothing but the open sky and your own naked soul. And that is terrifying. That is why most people never go there. That is why most people prefer to stay in Egypt, even if Egypt is a prison, because at least in Egypt you know who is in charge. You know the rules. You know your place. The wilderness is chaos. The wilderness is uncertainty. The wilderness is the death of the Pharaoh mind. and that is the Strait of Hormuz at its deepest level. The strait is the last thing you have to let go of, the last choke point, the last thing you believe you must control in order to survive. And when you finally let it go, when you walk through the water and into the wilderness, you discover something you never knew existed. You discover that the flow of life did not depend on your control. It never did. It was always moving, always abundant, always enough. You just could not see it, because you were too busy trying to manage the strait. Now look at what this means for the people who control the Strait of Hormuz today. They are not evil. They are not villains. They are just as trapped as everyone else. They believe that if they let go of the strait, everything will collapse. And that belief is the very thing that keeps the pattern running. The fear of chaos is what creates more chaos. The fear of losing control is what prevents the liberation that comes from surrendering control. But here is the paradox that the depth reveals. The only way to truly secure the Strait of Hormuz is to stop trying to control it. The only way to ensure the flow of oil, the stability of the global economy, the safety of the tankers, is to release the need to be the one controlling them. That sounds impossible. It sounds naive. It sounds like the kind of thing you would say if you had no understanding of real politics. And that is precisely what the Pharaoh mind says in response to any suggestion that it let go. That is naive. That is unrealistic. That will get people killed. And the Pharaoh mind is right from its own perspective, because from within the control pattern, letting go does look like death. But the depth knows something the surface does not. The depth knows that the Pharaoh mind is not the only way to organize human life. There is another way. A way based on trust, on mutual benefit, on the recognition that the flow of life is abundant and does not need to be controlled at the choke point. And the evidence for this way exists. It exists in every relationship that is based on trust rather than control. It exists in every organization that operates on transparency rather than hierarchy. It exists in every community that shares resources rather than hoarding them. It exists in every moment of your life when you let go of something you thought you needed and discovered that you were fine without it. That is the alternative. And it is not a fantasy. It is a real possibility that has been demonstrated in human history, in every culture, in every century. But it requires something that the Pharaoh mind cannot provide. It requires the courage to walk through the water. It requires the willingness to enter the wilderness. It requires the trust that the flow of life will sustain you, even when you are not controlling the strait. So here is the question that remains. And it is not a question you can answer with your intellect. It is a question you must answer with your life. Are you willing to let go of the strait? Are you willing to walk through the choke point into the open water? Are you willing to trust that the wilderness will teach you what Egypt never could? If the answer is yes, then you have already begun the journey, and the journey is long. But it is the only journey that matters, because the Strait of Hormuz is not about oil. It never was. It is about the Pharaoh mind inside you. And until that mind is released, the strait will keep generating the same conflict. In geopolitics, in your relationships, in your own soul. And once you see that, you do not go back. You cannot go back, because the pattern is now visible. And what is visible can be transformed. The strait is not the end. It is the beginning. And the beginning is always the same. You must stop trying to control the choke point. You must walk through the water. You must trust the wilderness. And that is the teaching that the institution preserved in the surface of Exodus. The depth reveals that the Exodus is not a story about history. It is a story about you. And the Strait of Hormuz is not a geopolitical fact. It is a psychological mirror. And the mirror is asking you one question. Will you stay in Egypt, or will you walk into the wilderness? The answer is already forming in your body. The only question is whether you will listen to it.